How does a powerful HOA president go from feared to humiliated in just 10 days? It started with one locked garage door and ended with the entire neighborhood laughing at her downfall. The first thing Calvin Rhodes noticed that Thursday evening wasn't the cool breeze in the air or the quiet hum of sprinklers on the street. It was the garage door. Closed, locked, and wrong. He lived alone in a 2-story brick house on the south side of Charlotte, and the one thing he knew with certainty was that he hadn't left his garage shut that morning. His routine never changed. Coffee, keys, remote click, garage up, car out, garage down. But this time, as he eased his sedan up the driveway after work, the sight waiting for him was a small alarm bell ringing in his chest. Something wasn't right. He pressed the remote. The door rattled, lifted, and revealed a scene so absurd he froze in place. A silver SUV parked neatly inside his garage. Not just blocking it, inside, like it belonged there. Calvin killed the engine and stepped out slowly. His eyes scanned the vehicle, an immaculate Lexus RX, pearl paint catching the last slice of daylight. He didn't own a Lexus. He didn't let anyone borrow his garage. And then, standing just inside the door that connected the garage to his kitchen, was Marjorie Kellum. Marjorie wasn't just any neighbor. She was the neighbor. 53 years old, sharp chin, short blonde bob cut with not a single strand out of place, and a habit of carrying clipboards as though she'd been born with one in her hand. She ran the HOA like a private kingdom. Grass too long? You got a note? Trash bins left out past 7 p.m. You got a picture and an email. Kids playing basketball too late? She'd call it a safety violation. Marjorie, Calvin said slowly, setting his briefcase on the hood of his own car. Do you want to explain why your Lexus is sitting in my garage? Marjorie didn't flinch. She folded her arms, chin tilted as though she were addressing a child who'd broken curfew. Street parking violates community standards, Calvin, she said crisply. I was at a board meeting. I couldn't very well leave my car on the curb. Your garage was empty, so I used it. Temporary situation. Calvin blinked. He actually laughed, short and bitter. Temporary situation? You broke into my house. Her voice rose, defensive now. It wasn't breaking in. The garage door was unlocked when I tried it. That's practically an invitation. And frankly, Calvin, as a homeowner here, you should appreciate that I'm preventing violations. Cars on the curb make this place look like an apartment complex. An invitation, he repeated, incredulous. This is private property. My garage, my lock. You don't get to decide what's convenient for you, she sighed, exasperated, as if he was the unreasonable one. You're being dramatic. I'll have it out of here soon. Just relax. The word relax hit Calvin like an insult. He'd had a long day managing outages at work, chasing down contractors and fielding calls from his boss. Now he was staring at his HOA president standing in his house, pretending her SUV had a rightful place beside his toolbox and bikes. For a moment, he considered losing his temper, shouting, threatening to call the police, but instead, something inside him cooled. He remembered the flight confirmation in his email, the Puerto Rico trip he'd been waiting for. 10 days of sand, salt water, and 0 HOA meetings. Calvin's eyes shifted to his suitcase, already packed and sitting by the stairs. He didn't need this fight. He didn't need this stress. He needed to think smarter, not louder. Fine, he said calmly, picking up his briefcase again. If you think this is acceptable, we'll see how acceptable it feels in a week. Marjorie frowned, confused. What's that supposed to mean? Calvin didn't answer. He walked into the kitchen, rolled his suitcase to the door, and pressed the button to close the garage. The heavy door rattled downward, sealing the Lexus and Marjorie's smug certainty inside. He locked the interior door with a click. She was still shouting when he wheeled his suitcase out the front door to the waiting rideshare. Something about board policy and community rights. He didn't look back. As the driver pulled away, Calvin leaned back in the seat, exhaling the kind of laugh that comes not from humor but from disbelief. 10 days in Puerto Rico. Sunsets, waves, and rum cocktails. And meanwhile, Back here in Charlotte, his garage was holding a hostage. But if Marjorie thought the neighborhood drama would end there, she was about to learn the hard way that one locked garage could change everything. By the time Calvin's plane touched down in San Juan the next morning, Marjorie Kellum was already in panic mode. She hadn't slept. Not much, anyway. Her Lexus was locked inside someone else's garage, her phone calls to Calvin had gone unanswered, and her husband, Douglas Kellum, wasn't thrilled when she told him what happened. "You what?" he said at the kitchen table that morning, his coffee sloshing dangerously close to the rim. "You parked where?" "In Calvin's garage." She snapped back, her tone more defensive than she intended. "It was open." Practically an invitation, Douglas set his cup down, rubbed his forehead. "Marjorie, that man works with computers all day. You think he won't notice his garage door magically shut itself with your car inside? What did you expect him to do? Thank you for the free parking?" She bristled. "It's not like that. I was trying to set an example. If we let one car on the street, soon we'll have 20. Then what? Property values drop? People start complaining. I keep order around here." Douglas leaned back, staring at her like he was looking at a stranger. "You don't keep order, Marjorie. You control. And now your SUV's trapped in Rhodes's garage while he's sipping margaritas somewhere." She hated when he spoke like that. Calm, blunt, pointing out truths she didn't want to hear. She opened her HOA binder, flipping through pages of regulations, as though the right paragraph would justify her actions. Later that day, she marched across the cul-de-sac and knocked on the door of Carolyn Ruiz, the HOA's treasurer. Carolyn was in her late 40s, a nurse at the local hospital, known for being pragmatic and kind. She answered in scrubs, looking exhausted from a night shift. "Marjorie, it's the middle of the day," Carolyn said, rubbing her eyes. "What's the emergency?" "My car is stuck in Calvin's garage," Marjorie blurted out. Carolyn blinked. "Stuck? How does someone's car just end up in another man's garage?" "I parked there during the meeting last night," Marjorie explained, her voice rising as though volume would make the story sound reasonable. "He wasn't home. The space was empty." "Perfectly logical," Carolyn crossed her arms. "Logical? You entered his property without permission. It's community property in a sense." "No," Carolyn cut her off, firm now. "That's his house, his lock, his space. There's nothing in the bylaws that gives you that right. You've gone too far this time, Marjorie." The words stung. Marjorie was used to neighbors bowing under her authority, grumbling but never pushing back. Now Carolyn, someone she thought of as an ally, was standing against her. "Well," Marjorie said stiffly, "I'll resolve it when Calvin gets back. Until then, I'll just manage." But managing wasn't easy. The Kellums had one car now, the family sedan, and Douglas needed it for work at the hardware store across town. Marjorie found herself relying on rides from neighbors she normally lectured about mailbox paint or lawn care. Each time she asked, she could feel their eyes on her, amused, judgmental. On the third day, Gordon Hayes, a retired postal worker who lived 2 doors down, chuckled openly when she requested a lift. "You? Need a ride?" he said, leaning on his cane. "Didn't think you folks up in the HOA ever needed help from us mere mortals." She gritted her teeth, slid into his passenger seat, and kept her mouth shut. But humiliation burned hot in her chest. The worst was still to come. At the weekly HOA board meeting, held in Carolyn's dining room, the whispers were already swirling. Pauline Jennings, another board member, smirked as Marjorie walked in without her usual clipboard. "Where's the Lexus tonight, Marjorie?" Pauline asked sweetly. "Still in storage?" The table erupted in muffled laughter. Marjorie slammed her folder down. "This is no laughing matter. Calvin has essentially kidnapped my vehicle." Carolyn raised an eyebrow. "Or you illegally used his garage." The back and forth grew heated. Marjorie barked about standards, bylaws, and precedent. The others pushed back, pointing out that she'd undermined her own authority. It ended with Carolyn calling the meeting to a close early, muttering something about leadership credibility. Walking home that evening, Marjorie felt something she hadn't felt in years. Loss of control. The power she held over her neighbors, the fear her name once carried, was slipping away. All because of one locked garage. But what she didn't realize yet was that every day Calvin stayed in Puerto Rico, her problems were multiplying. And soon, the entire neighborhood would be watching her downfall play out in real time. Calvin leaned back in his hotel chair, the sound of waves crashing faintly in the background. Puerto Rico had been on his mind for months. Sunlight, music, and the freedom to unplug from deadlines. But as he sipped a mojito by the pool, he couldn't help but picture Marjorie's silver Lexus sitting silently in his garage like an uninvited guest. He imagined her reaction once she realized he wasn't coming back in a day or two. That image alone made the drink taste sweeter. Back in Charlotte, Marjorie was pacing her living room like a caged animal. She had called Calvin's phone at least a dozen times, each one sent to voicemail. Texts went unanswered. Even an email she sent with the subject line, "Urgent HOA matter," had bounced back with his automated response. Out of office until the 14th. Limited access to email. The 14th. 10 whole days. "Douglas, this is outrageous," she fumed. "He's holding my property hostage. I could call the police." Her husband lowered his newspaper slowly. "And tell them what? That you trespassed and parked in his garage without asking. They'll laugh us out of the precinct, Marjorie. Maybe even charge you." She ignored him. The thought of her Lexus, her pride and joy, with custom leather seats and a spotless maintenance record, being trapped like a prisoner was unbearable. Worse yet, she had been seen. People knew. Every passing glance from a neighbor felt like mockery. On the 4th day, she flagged down Harold Benton, the handyman of the neighborhood, as he drove by in his rusted pickup. "Harold, you still have that drill set, don't you?" she asked, lowering her voice. He eyed her cautiously. "Yeah. Why?" "I was thinking, maybe you could help me, get into Calvin's garage. Quietly." "No fuss," Harold laughed, shaking his head. "Lady, you're out of your mind. That's breaking and entering. You want me locked up too?" Her cheeks flushed. "It's my car." "It's his garage," Harold shot back before driving away. That night, Marjorie sat at her desk, HOA files spread out in front of her. Rules, regulations, bylaws. She knew them all by heart, but none of them gave her what she wanted: power over Calvin's property. Meanwhile, Calvin was settling into his vacation routine. Early mornings on the beach at Isla Verde. Long afternoons exploring old San Juan, walking cobblestone streets lined with pastel houses and music spilling from open windows. Evenings spent with a small group of travelers he'd met at the hotel bar. One night, a woman named Lydia Freeman, a teacher from Ohio, asked him why he seemed so amused whenever he checked his phone. "It's a neighbor thing," Calvin said, chuckling. "The kind of story you couldn't make up. Let's just say someone tried to cross a boundary, and I decided to let natural consequences do the teaching." She raised an eyebrow. "Sounds like you're running a social experiment." "Something like that," he replied, clinking his glass against hers. Back home, Marjorie's frustration grew into obsession. She tried calling the HOA's attorney for advice, but he told her bluntly, "This is outside our jurisdiction. You're on your own." She even went as far as visiting the local police department, where the desk officer gave her a look halfway between disbelief and pity. "Madam," the officer said, "you entered his property without consent. That's trespassing. The only reason he hasn't pressed charges is probably because he doesn't want to deal with it. If I were you, I'd wait until he comes back and pray he's feeling generous." She left the station red-faced, muttering about incompetence. By the 6th day, Douglas had stopped offering her rides. He was tired of being dragged into her mess. "You made this bed," he told her flatly, "so you can lie in it." He handed her the keys to the sedan, but only for errands within a 5-mile radius. He needed the car for work. Marjorie found herself humbled in ways she'd never experienced. Walking to the pharmacy, taking the bus to the grocery store, catching stares from people who used to dread her HOA letters but now whispered behind her back. Each day the weight of humiliation pressed heavier. Each night she stared out her window at Calvin's house, the locked garage mocking her. But while she stewed in embarrassment, the rest of the neighborhood was slowly turning her blunder into entertainment, and soon her private shame would become a public spectacle. By the 7th day, Marjorie Kellum's life had shrunk to a circle no wider than the cul-de-sac. The Lexus sat silent behind Calvin's garage door, an expensive monument to her mistake, while she trudged through errands with the sedan like an ordinary neighbor. She hated how visible it all was. People noticed. They always noticed. That morning, she stepped out with a tote bag in hand, planning to catch the bus for groceries. Across the street, Martha Pennington, a widow in her 60s, was watering petunias. Martha raised a hand in greeting, but her smile carried a trace of amusement. "Morning, Marjorie. Walking today?" Marjorie tightened her grip on the tote. "Just stretching my legs, Martha." Martha's eyes flicked toward Calvin's driveway, then back to Marjorie. "Funny, haven't seen the Lexus lately." "Everything all right?" The words were light, casual, but Marjorie could hear the laughter under them. Her face burned. "It's in for maintenance," she snapped, then turned on her heel before Martha could answer. At the bus stop, she stood alone in her pressed blazer, clutching her bag while teenagers in hoodies scrolled on their phones and commuters sipped gas station coffee. For the first time in years, she felt invisible, powerless. A woman waiting on public transport when her luxury SUV sat locked in someone else's garage 100 yards away. Later that evening, her humiliation deepened. Douglas was already home when she returned, flipping channels on the recliner. "How was the bus ride?" he asked, not looking up. She slammed the milk onto the counter. "Don't start." "Not starting anything," he said. "Just wondering if maybe, just maybe, this is what happens when you take things too far." Marjorie spun toward him. "I was enforcing standards." "That's my job." He met her gaze finally, tired eyes hardening. "No, your job is to lead with common sense. But you don't. You nitpick, you scold, and now you're the one being laughed at." The words cut deeper than she admitted. Douglas had tolerated her rigidity for years, but now his patience was cracking. As if on cue, the doorbell rang. Marjorie smoothed her blouse and opened the door to find Pauline Jennings, the board secretary, standing with her arms crossed. "Evening, Marjorie," Pauline said coolly. "I came by to check on something." Marjorie forced a smile. "Of course. What is it?" "I heard," Pauline said, tilting her head, "that your car's been stored away. People are talking." "Is it true?" Marjorie stiffened. "It's being handled," Pauline smirked. "Handled how?" "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like Calvin played you at your own game, locked you out, and now you're stranded. Must be a strange feeling for you." Her composure cracked. "This is none of your business." "Oh, it's everyone's business," Pauline replied. "You've lectured half this neighborhood for years. Now the tables turn, and you expect silence. Good luck with that." She left with a satisfied grin, and Marjorie stood frozen at the door, the weight of humiliation pressing heavier than ever. That night, she scrolled through the HOA's private Facebook group. A new post caught her eye. It was from Gordon Hayes, the retired postal worker. A blurry photo of Calvin's closed garage door, captioned, "Guess whose car is still in there? $10 says it won't move till he's back." The comments poured in. Laughing emojis. Jokes about community storage fees. Neighbors who'd once feared her were now enjoying her downfall in public. Marjorie slammed the laptop shut. Her chest tightened with something unfamiliar. Not anger exactly, but shame. For years, she had wielded the HOA rulebook like a weapon. Now, with one impulsive decision, she had armed the entire neighborhood against herself. Upstairs, Douglas was already asleep. She sat alone in the darkened living room, staring at her reflection in the window. Her Lexus was just a few yards away, close enough to touch if not for the locked garage door. But what gnawed at her most wasn't losing the car, it was losing the control she'd built her life around, and soon even her allies would turn their backs completely. By the 8th day, word about Marjorie's trapped Lexus had spread far beyond the cul-de-sac. People whispered about it at the community pool, chuckled about it at the local coffee shop, and even joked about it at the school drop-off line. For years, Marjorie had been the one to control the narrative, her voice loudest, her rules absolute. But now, she was the punchline. The timing couldn't have been worse. That evening was the monthly HOA board meeting, scheduled at Carolyn Ruiz's home on Magnolia Drive. Normally, Marjorie relished these gatherings. She would sit at the head of the table, clipboard in hand, flipping through bylaws while neighbors fidgeted like schoolchildren waiting for detention. But this time, she felt her authority slipping the moment she walked through the door. Carolyn greeted her politely, but with none of the deference Marjorie was used to. Around the dining table sat Pauline Jennings, Gordon Hayes, and a few other board members. Instead of shuffling papers nervously, they were whispering to one another and grinning. Pauline even raised her phone as if she'd been mid-text, then tucked it away with a smirk when Marjorie sat down. Marjorie cleared her throat. "Shall we bring this meeting to order?" Pauline leaned back in her chair, crossing her legs. "By all means. Though I have to say, Marjorie, it's hard to take order from someone whose own vehicle is detained." A ripple of laughter went around the table. Marjorie's cheeks flushed. "That is a private matter, unrelated to HOA business." Carolyn interjected, her tone calm but pointed. "But it reflects on the board, doesn't it? We're supposed to set an example. If our president is making questionable choices, the community sees it." "I did not make a questionable choice," Marjorie snapped. "I prevented a violation." "Parking on the curb is against community standards," Gordon chuckled. "So instead of a car on the curb, you chose a car in someone else's garage. Tell me, which looks worse?" The table laughed again, louder this time. Marjorie gripped her folder so tightly her knuckles whitened. "This is insubordination," she hissed. "I've led this board faithfully for years. Without me, this neighborhood would fall into chaos." Carolyn leaned forward, folding her hands. "Marjorie, no one's denying you've worked hard. But there's a difference between leadership and control. And what you did with Calvin's garage, it crossed a line. The neighbors don't respect it. Frankly, some of us don't either." The words landed like blows. For the first time, Marjorie felt her authority slipping away in real time. She searched the faces around the table, hoping for support, but found only smirks and averted eyes. Douglas, who rarely attended meetings, but had accompanied her this time, finally spoke up. "Maybe it's time you listen," he said quietly. "You've pushed people too far. This isn't leadership, Marjorie. It's ego." She turned to him, shocked. "Betrayed. You're supposed to be on my side." "I am," he said, his voice heavy. "But being on your side doesn't mean letting you destroy yourself." For a moment, silence blanketed the room. Then Pauline broke it with a sly grin. "Well, at least Calvin will come home to one clean garage. We can't say the same for our reputation." The laughter that followed wasn't muffled this time. It was open, sharp, and cutting. Marjorie stood abruptly, her chair screeching against the hardwood floor. "This meeting is adjourned," she declared, storming toward the door. "Adjourned?" Carolyn said, shaking her head. "No, Marjorie. This meeting goes on, with or without you." Marjorie froze, back still to the room, before slamming the door shut behind her. Outside, the night air hit her like a slap. She hurried to the sedan where Douglas waited silently in the driver's seat. As they pulled away, she stared at her reflection in the passenger side window. For years, she had been the one to make others squirm. Tonight, the entire board had turned the tables. But humiliation has a way of breeding desperation, and Marjorie was already plotting how to reclaim control, even if it meant going further than she ever had before. By day 9, Marjorie couldn't walk down her own street without feeling eyes on her. Every crack of a screen door, every laugh from a porch seemed aimed at her. The neighborhood she once ruled with citations and warnings had transformed into a stage, and she was the unwilling star of a comedy she couldn't control. It started with subtle gestures. A paper plate taped to her mailbox with the words, "Reserved parking," scribbled in marker. A toy car left on her driveway, parked neatly as if mocking the Lexus trapped in Calvin's garage. At first, she tore them down in fury, but by the third prank, she stopped reacting. Reaction was fuel, and she refused to give anyone the satisfaction. But inside, her pride was fraying. On that morning, she decided to walk to the corner store for milk. As she rounded the bend, she passed Trina Miles, a young mother with 2 kids who were chalking up the sidewalk. The children giggled as they drew a big rectangle and labeled it garage, scribbling a tiny SUV inside. Trina gave a tight smile. Kids, don't be rude. They're mocking me, Marjorie spat. Trina shrugged. Maybe they're just drawing what they hear at home. You can't control people's stories anymore. The words landed heavy. She muttered something about respect and hurried past, her tote bag swinging angrily at her side. At the same time, across town, Calvin was sitting in a cafe in Old San Juan, laughing as Lydia Freeman teased him. She'd become his travel companion of sorts during the trip. You look like a man enjoying more than the beach, she said. You check that phone like you're waiting for updates on a soap opera. Maybe I am, Calvin grinned. Except this one set in Charlotte, starring my HOA president, who thought she could commandeer my garage. Lydia laughed so loudly the barista glanced over. You locked her in? Her car, yeah, not her. I'm not a monster. He sipped his espresso. I just figured, let the situation breathe. Sometimes people need to taste their own medicine. Meanwhile, back in the cul-de-sac, that medicine was bitter. Marjorie's authority crumbled further when Gordon Hayes organized a garage watch. Every evening, a group of neighbors sat in lawn chairs with beers in hand, staring at Calvin's driveway like it was a stage. When Marjorie passed by on her evening walk, Gordon called out, "Evening, Marjorie. Any chance we'll get a show tonight? Maybe a jailbreak?" The group roared with laughter. Her face burned crimson. "This is harassment," she hissed. "No," Gordon replied coolly. "This is community engagement. Isn't that what you always wanted?" She stormed back home, her heels clicking sharp against the pavement. Inside, Douglas was on the recliner again, shaking his head. "You've lost them," he said softly. "They'll come around," she insisted. "They always do," but her voice cracked, betraying doubt. By the 10th day, the story had spread beyond the neighborhood. A photo of her Lexus in Calvin's garage, taken through a gap in the door by some daring teenager, surfaced on a local community Facebook page. The caption read, "HOA president takes her own rules too far. Guess who's paying the price?" Within hours, the post had dozens of comments. Strangers weighed in. Some defended her, but most mocked. Words like arrogant and power trip dotted the thread. When Marjorie saw it, she slammed her laptop shut so hard the hinge cracked. "This is defamation," she told Douglas. He didn't look up from his paper. "No, Marjorie. This is what happens when you lose perspective." That night, she stood at her upstairs window again, staring across the street at Calvin's house. The garage was silent, the Lexus invisible but painfully close. For years she had convinced herself she was protecting the neighborhood, saving it from decline. Now she realized her neighbors didn't see her as a savior. They saw her as a tyrant, and they were enjoying her fall. But what she didn't know was that Calvin's flight was landing soon, and his return would be the final act in a story that had already stripped her of the control she prized most. While Marjorie Kellum's world seemed to shrink with every glare from her neighbors, Calvin Rhodes's life had expanded into something freer than he'd felt in years. For the first time since his divorce, he was living in the moment, far from boardrooms and server outages. Every morning he woke to the sound of gulls circling over Isla Verde Beach. He'd jog barefoot on the sand, the Atlantic stretching wide and endless beside him, before grabbing a plate of fried plantains from the hotel cafe. And every morning, when he checked his phone, another voicemail from Marjorie appeared. He never listened past the first sentence. "Calvin, this is unacceptable. Calvin, I demand you release my vehicle. Calvin, you will regret this if you don't comply. Delete, delete, delete." Lydia Freeman, the teacher from Ohio he'd befriended, teased him one morning as he scrolled through his inbox. "Still ignoring the queen of your cul-de-sac?" she asked, sipping iced coffee under a striped umbrella. "She's not a queen." Calvin chuckled. "More like a dictator whose castle fell down." Lydia grinned. "You know, most people would have blown up at her, maybe even called the cops." "You just let her stew." Calvin leaned back, letting the sun warm his face. "Sometimes silence teaches louder than shouting. She'll learn that, or maybe she won't. Either way, not my problem." In the evenings, he wandered Old San Juan. Lanterns lit narrow cobblestone streets. Musicians played guitars outside corner cafes. He tried mofongo for the first time, danced clumsily at a salsa bar, and laughed until his stomach hurt. Each time his phone buzzed, he pictured Marjorie pacing her kitchen, furiously typing or leaving another message. The contrast made him laugh harder. One night, as he sat on the hotel balcony with Lydia and a couple from Michigan they'd met, Calvin finally told the full story. "So she just parked in your garage?" Lydia asked, incredulous. "Like it was public property," Calvin said. "She even said the garage door being unlocked was an invitation," the Michigan couple roared. Lydia nearly spit her drink. "So what did you do?" Lydia pressed, though she already knew the answer. "I shut the garage, locked it, grabbed my suitcase, and left for the airport. Haven't looked back since." The group laughed so loudly a guest 2 balconies over called, "Sounds like someone's got HOA problems." Calvin grinned. "Not anymore." "She does." Meanwhile, back in Charlotte, Marjorie was unraveling. She hadn't just lost face, she had lost her rhythm. For years, every day was scheduled. Inspections, reports, little notes tucked under windshield wipers. Now, her authority was hollow. Neighbors chuckled when she walked by, and even her husband kept his distance. By day 10, she had stopped trying to defend herself. The Facebook post showing her Lexus had gone semi-viral in local circles, and people she barely knew were messaging her with sarcastic comments. The HOA board, once her loyal base, now treated her like a liability. That evening, while Calvin sipped a final cocktail by the hotel pool, Marjorie sat alone at her dining table, staring at her untouched dinner. Her phone buzzed again. Another notification, another comment, another reminder that she was the butt of every joke. Upstairs, Douglas packed for a weekend fishing trip with friends. He didn't even bother asking if she wanted to come. She whispered to herself, "They'll regret mocking me." But even as she said it, her voice cracked. For the first time, she wondered if she'd pushed so hard that there was no path back. Back in Puerto Rico, Calvin checked in for his return flight. He glanced at his phone one last time. Another angry voicemail from Marjorie sat waiting. He didn't open it. Instead, he slipped the phone in his pocket and smiled. "Ready for home?" Lydia asked, brushing sand from her hair. "Ready to see the look on her face when I hit that garage remote?" he said with a laugh. But he didn't yet realize how far Marjorie had fallen, or how public her embarrassment had become, by the time he returned to Charlotte. Marjorie Kellum was no stranger to stress. She had weathered disputes over fence heights, trash can placement, and holiday decorations with icy composure. But 10 days without her Lexus, and 10 days of being laughed at in her own neighborhood, had carved cracks in her armor. On the morning of Calvin's scheduled return, she stood at her bay window, staring at the garage across the street. She hadn't slept much, her mind running endless circles. Would he humiliate her further? Would he report her to the HOA attorney? To the police? The thought of losing not just respect but her position made her chest tighten. Douglas shuffled past in a fishing cap, cooler in hand. "Heading out," he muttered. "Don't wait up," she called after him. "You're leaving now? When everything's falling apart?" He paused at the door, sighing. "Everything's been falling apart for a long time, Marjorie. I just didn't want to admit it." Then he left, closing the door softly. Her lips trembled. She wasn't used to being alone, not like this. For years she had measured her worth in control, neighbors following her directives, Douglas nodding along, the HOA running like a machine under her command. Now, she had nothing but silence and the faint hum of cicadas outside. By noon, she snapped. She grabbed her HOA binder and marched across the cul-de-sac, heels clacking against the pavement. She stopped in front of Calvin's garage door, flipping through pages as if a bylaw might magically appear to justify prying it open. A few neighbors sat on porches, watching openly. "Afternoon, Marjorie," Gordon Hayes called out. "Planning another inspection?" She ignored him, scanning the binder until her vision blurred. Her hands shook. Finally, in a moment of pure desperation, she dropped the binder and pulled a screwdriver from her tote bag. Gasps rippled across the street. Someone whispered, "Is she really?" She jammed the screwdriver into the crack where the garage door met the frame, grunting as she pried. Sweat beaded on her forehead, her blouse sticking to her back. The metal screeched. The garage didn't budge. Ma'am? A voice called. It was Officer Ryan Copley, a local patrolman, pulling up in his cruiser. He stepped out slowly, arms crossed. What exactly are you doing? Marjorie froze, breath ragged. This is my car. My Lexus is in there. The officer raised an eyebrow. And this is his garage. Which means what you're doing right now is attempted breaking and entering. It's not breaking in, she snapped, voice rising. He trapped it. He trapped me. I'm the president of this HOA, and I demand you make him open it. Ryan pulled out a notepad. President of the HOA doesn't trump private property laws. You parked in there without permission. Legally, you're lucky he hasn't pressed charges. Neighbors gathered closer now, some with phones out recording. Marjorie's chest heaved. She wanted to scream, to demand respect. But the weight of their smirks, the flashing phone cameras, and the officer's steady gaze pinned her in place. Ryan softened his tone. Here's my advice. Step away from the garage, go back home, and wait. He'll be back soon. Don't make this worse than it already is. Marjorie dropped the screwdriver, her hands trembling. She turned on her heel and stormed back to her house, slamming the door behind her. Inside, she collapsed into a chair, staring at the abandoned binder on the floor. Her reflection in the glass cabinet caught her eye. Hair frizzed, blouse wrinkled, face tight with fury and shame. For the first time, she didn't see the commanding figure of authority she always imagined. She saw a desperate woman fighting a losing battle. Meanwhile, miles above the Atlantic, Calvin's plane began its descent. He stretched in his seat, a relaxed smile tugging at his lips. The vacation had been everything he needed, and he felt lighter, calmer, even playful. He imagined walking into his house, dropping his bags, and pressing that garage remote. The mental picture of Marjorie's face kept him grinning all through landing. But he had no idea that while he was sipping piña coladas, Marjorie had nearly turned her embarrassment into a crime, and that the neighborhood was waiting eagerly to see what would happen when he finally came home. When Calvin's rideshare turned into the neighborhood just after sunset, he noticed right away that things looked different. Porch lights glowed brighter than usual. Families lingered outside even though the air was thick and muggy, and more than a few heads turned as his sedan rolled down the street. It was as though the whole block had been waiting for him. The driver pulled up to his driveway, and Calvin stepped out with his suitcase. He spotted Gordon Hayes, perched in a lawn chair with a beer in hand, grinning like a man who'd just won a bet. A couple of teenagers whispered nearby, phones at the ready. "Welcome home, Calvin," Gordon called out, raising his can. "Been quiet around here without you?" Calvin chuckled. "Somehow I doubt that." He walked to his front door, keyed it open, and inhaled the familiar scent of his house. Setting his bags down, he pulled the garage remote from the counter. His thumb hovered over the button for a second, then pressed. The door rattled upward, and the silver Lexus came into view. Its paint still gleamed, though a thin layer of dust had settled on the hood. The neighbors broke into laughter and applause, the sound rolling across the cul-de-sac like a cheer at a ball game. Across the street, Marjorie burst out of her house. Her heels clattered against the pavement as she stormed toward him, face flushed, hair pulled back too tightly. "Calvin Rhodes!" she shouted. "This has gone on long enough. You release my car immediately." Calvin leaned against the doorframe, calm as ever. "Looks like it's already released," he gestured toward the garage. "All you had to do was wait." Her eyes widened, her voice sharp with desperation. "Wait? Do you have any idea what I've endured this week? The disrespect? The humiliation?" "Sounds like a taste of your own medicine," Calvin replied evenly. "You've been handing that out for years." The neighbors murmured in agreement, some even nodding. Marjorie's voice shook. "I was doing my job, maintaining standards, protecting property values. By trespassing?" Calvin asked. "By using my home like it's public storage? Marjorie, you crossed a line, and instead of admitting it, you doubled down." She glanced around. Dozens of eyes were on her. The board members, neighbors she'd chastised for garden gnomes, porch swings, basketball hoops. None looked sympathetic. Her husband Douglas appeared at the edge of their lawn, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. She had counted on him to back her, but he stayed silent. Calvin walked into the garage, slid into his car, and pressed the remote again. The door rolled down, sealing the Lexus inside with him. The crowd erupted into laughter again, and Marjorie's hands clenched into fists. A minute later, the door rose once more. Calvin stepped out, tossed the keys onto the Lexus's dashboard, and addressed her directly. "There," he said. "Your car's free. But you should know this, Marjorie. Respect isn't something you demand with a clipboard. It's something you earn. And you've just spent the last 10 days proving you don't have it." Silence blanketed the street. For once, Marjorie had no retort. Her lips parted, then closed again. She picked up the keys with shaking hands and slid into the Lexus, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. The engine started, but the drive home was barely 20 feet away. She pulled into her own driveway, headlights cutting through the tension like blades. Douglas followed her inside without a word. The crowd slowly dispersed, murmurs and chuckles fading into the night. Calvin exhaled, exhaustion from travel finally catching up to him. But beneath it was a quiet satisfaction. He hadn't yelled, hadn't threatened, hadn't even lifted a finger beyond locking a door. And yet the message had been louder than any shouting match could have been. But the story wasn't quite over, for Marjorie's downfall had left the neighborhood with a choice: cling to old fears of her authority, or finally start living without them. The next morning, the cul-de-sac felt different. There were no clipped notes tucked under doormats, no watchful glares from across the street. For the first time in years, the neighborhood was quiet in a way that felt free. Kids rode their bikes in circles without worrying about noise complaints. A basketball thudded against a driveway hoop, and no one rushed to hide it. Even Martha Pennington's wind chimes, which Marjorie once claimed were distracting, jingled proudly in the late summer breeze. Calvin sat on his porch with a mug of coffee, watching it all unfold. He wasn't a man who enjoyed conflict, but he understood boundaries. And for too long, Marjorie had ignored them, mistaking authority for ownership. What had happened wasn't just about a garage. It was about respect. Mid-morning, Douglas walked over. He looked tired, his fishing cap in one hand, his gaze on the ground. "Calvin," he began, his voice heavy. "I don't know what to say. I told her it was wrong from the start. But she doesn't listen. Not to me. Not to anyone." Calvin nodded. "I know, Douglas. I didn't do this to punish her. I did it because arguing with her doesn't work. She had to see what happens when people stop giving her the control she craves." Douglas sighed. "She won't admit it, but you might have taught her more than all of us combined." He shifted awkwardly. "I'm sorry you got dragged into it. No hard feelings," Calvin said. "But from here on, the garage stays off limits." Douglas gave a short laugh, the first genuine one Calvin had heard from him in years, before heading back across the street. Later that evening, Marjorie appeared briefly. She drove the Lexus slowly around the block, as if testing whether the neighbors were still watching. They were. But this time, there were no smirks or comments, just silence. She parked in her driveway and walked inside, shoulders hunched, a woman shrunken by her own pride. Calvin didn't celebrate her humiliation. If anything, he pitied her. Power built on fear had a short lifespan, and Marjorie had just learned that the hard way. He hoped, in some corner of herself, she'd understand the lesson. Leadership isn't about control. It's about trust. Without it, even the loudest voice goes unheard. That night, Calvin sat at his desk, unpacked from the trip, and reflected. The whole ordeal had been absurd, almost comical, but it had left a mark. Too often, people allow others to take liberties because confrontation feels messy. But letting people cross boundaries only feeds their arrogance. Sometimes the quietest stand, the kind that doesn't involve shouting or threats, sends the clearest message. The neighborhood had changed too. With Marjorie's authority broken, people began speaking up more. Neighbors who had once tiptoed around her started planting what they liked, gathering on porches longer, living as if their homes were truly their own again. Calvin didn't mean to spark a rebellion, but in a way, he had. For him, the lesson was simple. Respect is earned, not demanded. You can't force people to follow you by intimidation. You can only lead by example, and when you forget that, even the strongest grip on power slips away. As the streetlights flickered on and the cul-de-sac settled into night, Calvin felt something he hadn't in a long time, a deep sense of peace. He'd drawn a line without lifting his voice, and the neighborhood was better for it. And maybe, just maybe, Marjorie would learn to live with less power and more humility. Time would tell. So if you're listening to this story and thinking about the Marjorie in your life, the coworker who oversteps, the boss who takes too much, or the neighbor who pushes too far, remember this: you don't have to fight loud to be heard. Sometimes the most powerful response is the quiet one. Respect your boundaries, stand firm, and don't let anyone convince you that their entitlement is your responsibility. And if you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more. Every story we share carries a lesson, and sometimes the lessons are closer to home than we think.